Great. Thank you to all our presenters, our panelists. We have about 20 minutes now for questions. There are some in the Q&A, and one from Robert Muir-Wood says, was the previous estimation of the quality of Turkish mid-rise building stock consistent with performance in the recent earthquake? I know David has responded to that in writing, but David, would you like to expand on that at all?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for the question, Robert. Yeah, it's very difficult to break out the performance of individual structures. I think what we've seen on the ground, unfortunately, is that these mid-rise structures are probably as vulnerable as we've seen in the past. And unfortunately, those, as we've seen that back in 1999, such structures are not only at a great collapse risk, but have very small void space when they do collapse. So this is part of the catastrophe we've seen now. But we don't have, the pager system does not specifically address individual building types in the model that we have online. It's simply the overall vulnerability of the building stock. So we can't do a one-to-one comparison of different types of structures at this point. I think John and Vitor and others at the GEM Foundation that have used the GEM OpenQuake model to look at individual structure types could probably speak to the response of those structures more directly.
Great, thanks, David. And we have a question from Asli Kaplan. As a geologist from the Geological Survey of Turkey, I believe our biggest challenges have been, one, raising the public awareness about earthquakes, and two, auditing the engineering and materials that go into building apartments. How would you approach these problems? And before I ask someone to respond, Asli, I'm sure I speak for all of us in offering our condolences for the disaster that's hit your country. Panelists, Hector, would you like to give that a go first?
Well, regarding quality of materials, that's an area of structural engineers and the building code regulations. So, for instance, here in Colombia, I cannot speak, I don't know how the Turkish system works, but here in Colombia and in many cities and in many other countries, you have a public works authority, which is responsible for for reviewing the structural plans and structural calculations. And also, once you are building a given structure, they are also responsible for checking the critical elements, right? And the quality of materials. So that's perhaps something that it's out of the scope of the geological survey or surveys in this case. I will leave it at that. Regarding public awareness, we use different platforms like social media, where, for instance, in the commemoration of a past earthquake, we create, let's say, an infographic of the characteristics of the earthquake and the consequence of the earthquake. That's just to remind the people that these things happen. And when they occur, there are consequences in terms of fatalities, injuries, and losses. That's some of our approaches. We also have online applications where we provide information regarding the historical earthquakes and also all the other products that we produce in the Colombian Geological Survey.
Thanks, Hector. Mark, do you have any thoughts on this?
Well, certainly the question raised there is quite relevant, that you can have good building regulations, but they're only beneficial if they're used. And so the enforcement's very important when it comes to how buildings are designed, the materials that are incorporated into it. That's not only a challenge in Turkey, but we see that with our own program in our part of the world through our Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, that it is a challenge in other countries in enforcing building regulations. Just on risk products and helping the public understand risk, we have a bit of a challenge in Australia because we're intraplate. And so we don't have damaging earthquakes very often. And so it's with risk information that we try and raise awareness that people experience bushfires and floods and severe wind events more frequently, but you also have to be aware of earthquake and make sure that your buildings, your infrastructure is resilient to it.
Thanks, David. You touched on this. Can you answer this one?
Yeah, the first question in terms of public awareness, I think unfortunately every disaster is an opportunity to really ask the tough questions. And I know, you know, the immediate concern within Turkey is to look at the region that's affected. But one thing I've seen, for instance, in the Los Angeles Times, asking the question, do we have these kinds of buildings where we are? And what do we do if we do have those? And I think this opportunity right now is for those within Turkey to ask the same questions around the nation, and to really to understand what they face in different areas and worldwide. Do we have these types of structures, and how will they affect our post-earthquake scene?
Thanks. And Chesley, is there an insurance industry perspective on this?
Well, I will say that when we build our models, we do work with local engineers to understand building, the building codes themselves, but also enforcement. And unfortunately, in a lot of cases, we do hear that there are enforcement issues. I think we're hearing that in this case as well. So that's something we do regularly think about when we're thinking about fragility of structures in different geographies. So it's definitely something we're aware of as an issue.
Great, thanks. Well, staying on the same kind of theme, in the survey that we conducted before this webinar series, many of the survey responders have mentioned that when geoscientists talk about uncertainties in assessing hazards and risks, this information gets misunderstood by policy and decision makers and often makes it difficult to get public support for expensive kind of long-term mitigation actions. So what has been your experience in that context, and how have your organizations managed that challenge? Maybe I'll go to David first.
Yeah, very, very good question. There's a very significant difference between the uncertainties in a real-time response mode and the uncertainties in a long-term risk mitigation. With the real-time response, it's a matter of putting in the information that's uncertain in terms of the data that's constraining that particular event that just happened, and that uncertainty hopefully is reduced with time, and we try to communicate that. I think Chesley could probably mention the challenges for long-term risk mitigation, where it's really the tail end of the probabilities that drive the most expensive losses, and that's where the uncertainties get to be the largest. So just speaking from the short-term post-event response, I think as long as the information that goes out attracts the attention and that generates the response that's necessary, the uncertainty in the information, for instance, from pager, is not as important as getting the general consensus of what the response is needed. But in long-term risk mitigation, those tail end members really drive the losses.
Hector, your thoughts on communicating uncertainties?
Okay, well, I will start by saying that at least in my experience, we have not received such feedback from our end users. No, those concerns regarding uncertainty. But I would like to point out that perhaps we are not communicating the uncertainties in a language that the decision makers or our end users understand or are fully aware of. The challenges that we have experienced, and I would like also to call them a type of uncertainty, is the limited knowledge that sometimes our end users have regarding the use of our risk assessments. So, for example, once we finish a study for a city, one of the common questions from our users is, how can I use this? Where can I apply this? There is certainly let's say an important work to do there, and it's also work that it's benefited from the participation or the accompanying of the national unit for disaster risk reduction here in Colombia, which is, let's say, the analogous to FEMA in the US or the civil protection in Italy.
Thanks, Chesley. You must have a specific perspective on this.
Yeah, so uncertainties come into play in lots of different ways when we do our risk assessments, and it's a really critical part of making it clear like what a data is appropriate and how. But I think one of the things to think about, while what David said about uncertainties in the event rates for the really big events is quite uncertain. Building performance at strong ground motions, we have a pretty good sense that it will be when pretty significant damage will happen. But really understanding where damage starts is where the biggest uncertainties are in thinking about building performance. And when you're looking at the overall like financial impact of an event, often it's the extent of the footprint of damage, whether it's slightly bigger or slightly smaller, can have a big impact in the total losses. So that's also an important piece of the puzzle, linking in the fact that it's very hard to know for any individual structure exactly when damage will start. So just another perspective to add.
Thanks. And Mark, what's your experience in this?
Well, first of all, when it comes to uncertainty, when we are reporting outcomes, we try to actually highlight that in the reporting as to just where all the uncertainties lie and what uncertainties we have been able to actually capture in the modelling and the uncertainties that we haven't. So where we do capture uncertainty, for example, with earthquake hazard or wind hazard, we communicate that with confidence limits, so we can look at how confident we are. In my presentation, I showed the simulation software VORs for housing. Every house unzips in a unique way. So in reporting those vulnerabilities, we can actually show the spread of outcomes depending on how houses have been modelled to fail. And we've also, if you like, modelled the uncertainty even in the building stock and how you apply mitigation. So with that recently completed mitigation study for wind in southeast Queensland, where a subset of the building stock is being, if you like, virtually retrofitted to reduce the risk, the high risk properties, we can actually attribute mitigation measures in a range of ways, randomly selecting it, and look at just what the uncertainty of the outcomes is, because depending on the selection, you'll get a different outcome. So I guess it's a real challenge, making it clear just where you have actually built uncertainty into your outcomes and just what you haven't captured, so that your stakeholders, your decision makers are aware of that.
Great, thanks all. There's another question in the chat from David, not the same David. Is there a reliable source where information about earthquake vulnerability of different business types is provided? Not in terms of general economic loss, but listed for every specific business type, for example, steel production, processing, chemical plants, etc. Let's go back to Mark for that. Do you know of any sources like that?
No, it's a good question, and different buildings, different businesses will have different resilience to the impact of natural hazards, and we see that with flooding, where some businesses can recover very quickly after an event and resume operation. Other businesses, because of the nature of the operation, the equipment they have, the lead time for actually replacing it can be out of operation for a very extended period of time. So from our perspective, we don't really fully understand that, but we certainly are aware of the issue.
Okay, thanks. Chesley, you would have specific information on this kind of sector.
Yeah, so because the insurance coverage for large industrial facilities is, for catastrophes is very important for that market. We do spend a lot of time thinking about large industrial facilities like petrochemical or steel plants. And we build our understanding of their performance by breaking them down into components, thinking about how the different sub-pieces of that facility would be impacted, for example, by ground shaking or flooding or wind. The one thing I will say is that this is one area where we can use information from one geography and apply it to another. For example, most petrochemical facilities are fairly similar in how they're set up. There's only a few, few companies that build petrochemical facilities. So when we see how they perform in the Maule earthquake, for example, we can then use that to think about how petrochemical facilities, for example, say in Trinidad, might perform in a strong earthquake. So it is a place where we can use some past experiences to inform future performance.
Great, thanks. David and Hector, if you don't mind, I'll go on to another question and ask Chesley to respond to this first again. Looking from the perspective of a community, for example, a municipality, they're often faced with planning for multiple hazards. Risk profiles will be different for each hazard, and planning mitigation actions may not be in sync with each other, or they may even be in conflict. Do you see communities struggling with these issues? Are they conducting multi-hazard risk evaluations? And what's the role of a National Geological Survey Organization in facilitating this multi-hazard type of assessment?
Yeah, I would say that communities are getting better about thinking about risk of all forms, and that they really are asking themselves, what aren't we modeling? What aren't we thinking about? We as a modeling firm are constantly, pushed to fill in the gaps of the things that are quote unquote unmodeled, or help come up with approaches to think about even just how to scale losses for things that aren't accounted for. So it's definitely something that is on, is top of mind. And it's something we're thinking about at the community level, though it really takes the initiative of that community to be thinking broadly. So I guess it's really up to the individual driving the risk assessment to think as broadly as possible.
Mark, do you have any specific examples of this kind of multi-hazard situation?
From our own work here in Australia, we tend to actually do studies where we're focusing on one peril or one hazard. So we cover a whole range of natural hazards, but we tend to look at them in isolation. Though with we're scoping presently a succeeding project to the one in southeast Queensland, and that will be multi-hazard. So we'll be looking at flood, severe wind and storm surge, and a tropical cyclone can deliver all three. So understanding, how they interact. What I can say, though, is addressing multiple hazards has an opportunity. And to give you an example of that, we've completed work in Western Australia where we've been looking at the most vulnerable type of buildings that we have in Australia to earthquake, which is our older unreinforced masonry, and providing information on how to retrofit those. Now, working with state and local government, they've now wanted that expanded to include wind retrofit, and how could we retrofit for bushfire if this particular property is in a peri-urban area. And so we have been producing products where you're combining the retrofit not just for one hazard but for two, in this case wind and earthquake. And the benefits are quite significant, because if you're going to intervene with a building and gain access to strengthen it, for example, you can strengthen it more cost effectively for multiple hazards at the same time. So that is sort of a trend that we're seeing in Australia, not just thinking of earthquake or wind or flood in isolation, but taking a broader resilience approach when it comes to our building stock.
Great, thanks. Hector, Colombia must have these kind of issues, multi-hazard.
Indeed, but we also look at each hazard independently. That's the reality right now. So each municipality shall identify all possible natural and even human-made hazards that can affect the territory. And for instance, for hazards such as volcanic or landslides or floods, the results of this analysis are used for land use planning. And in this analysis, maps are produced and the territory is classified in high, intermediate, and low hazard zones. So for high hazard zones, I understand that we just overlap the high risk or hazard zones, and that is zone or area with a restricted use. So, and if you have already settlements there, you have to relocate them. That's the approach here. Obviously, relocation has many issues that is not always successful. And for other risk zones, such as intermediate hazard and risk zones, where you can implement mitigation measures, my guess, I lack the knowledge here, my guess is that we just apply a precautionary principle and we use the most restrictive solution.
Thanks. David, we have like 1 minute. Could you respond to that question very quickly?
Yeah, FEMA in the United States has done a very good job at doing a national risk index so that municipalities can look at the relative risks at any one census tract level and prioritize what the multi-hazard strategy would be there. So once you build a large inventory of structures, you can apply different vulnerability functions and get different risk indices quite nicely.
Great, thanks. So that's our time. Thanks for that wonderful discussion. To our 4 panelists, particular shout out to Mark, who had to stay up very late to do this. But excellent discussion. Thanks to all our presenters. And it's my job now to pass us on to John Schneider, who will be chairing panel 4 on partnerships and good governance for advancing hazard and risk assessments. Over to you, John.